Plugged In, the 11th week of protests paralyzing Hong Kong's Central District again, as an estimated 1.7 million marched in the rain to demand freedom from China's authoritarian rule. This after months of violent clashes and the shutdown of Hong Kong's international airport. What do protesters want? Is Beijing prepared to use military force? And what could that mean for global business and trade? On this edition of Plugged In, the Hong Kong protests and fears of a China crackdown. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren. What started out weeks ago as opposition to an extradition bill that would have allowed suspects arrested in Hong Kong to be handed over to authorities in mainland China has now evolved into a large protest movement aimed squarely at maintaining Hong Kong's democratic freedoms and its special status within China. Organizers say more than 1.5 million people ignored the rain for a mid-August Sunday protest. This is the largest protest crowd to date. Hong Kong protesters are demanding a full withdrawal of the extradition bill, the resignation of Beijing-backed Chief Executive Carrie Lam, and an official retraction of the government's description of the protests as riots. But with Chinese tanks and troops massing just outside Hong Kong's border, many worry what Beijing's next move is going to be. VOA correspondent Michael O'Sullivan reports from Hong Kong.
A sea of umbrellas and a peaceful show of force as tens of thousands of protesters spilled into the streets in defiance of authorities after Sunday's rally.
Because I just can't help it, of the history that happened this recent few months. I feel obliged as a Hong Kong belonger to come out to protest, to make the government realize that we meant business.
Braving the rain in a scene reminiscent of the umbrella movement protests of 2014. Now it's about an extradition bill with China that protesters say undermines Hong Kong's legal system. The bill was suspended but not withdrawn, and they worry that it could be reinstated. This 17-year-old girl was too young 5 years ago, but now has joined the protests.
And if the extradition law is passed, then we will really forever lose our freedom in Hong Kong. And that's why when I have the ability this time, I want to stand up and protect Hong Kong.
Last week's protests at the airport led to canceled flights and stranded passengers. Some say it hurt the movement.
We apologize for any inconvenience caused, and you can see that we try many ways, but the chief executive does not answer any of our demands, so we'll keep trying it.
Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam is the focus of the anger. The government has supporters who rallied Saturday. They say these protests hurt Hong Kong, now in danger of recession. There is also a danger that China will send in troops.
You know that if China strongly move into Hong Kong, I think that will destroy the one country, two system. That's the whole world, not just America, but also the Euro will against China and fight for us.
There is no other choice, said another at the rally.
Every one of us is scared, but we still have to try our very best to fight for our freedom.
Satellite images from space show dozens of Chinese tanks and paramilitary vehicles parked inside the Shenzhen Sports Center just outside Hong Kong. And the New York Times is reporting that as many as 12,000 police officers are on standby. Michael O'Sullivan is covering the Hong Kong protests for us. He joins us from Hong Kong's commercial district. Nice to see you, and tell me, what have you learned since you've been there?
Well, Greta, first let me tell you where I am. I'm basically midway behind me, the area called Admiralty, where the major government buildings are, the courts, the Legislative Council, the police headquarters, where there have been many protests. And in the other direction, ahead of me, is the area where on Sunday, as you said, 1.5 or 1.7 million people took to the streets in a peaceful protest, and a protest that some people say marks a turning point after a lot of tension, weeks of violent clashes, tear gas fired on protesters, and that airport shut down for several days that resulted in nearly 1,000 flights canceled. And for the protesters, this was a chance to demonstrate that the movement is still vital and that it can pursue a peaceful path forward in trying to extract some concessions from the Hong Kong government.
What do people expect is going to happen? I mean, give me a prediction in the next week or two to come.
Well, every day there are protests, small, large, some of them planned. We know on the weekend there are always large protests. There are protests going on right now. This is the 1-month anniversary of an incident at a subway station when about 100 men in white shirts, they're presumed to be triad gang members, pro-Beijing, came in and beat people. And there are, protests commemorating that today. And major events on the weekend, but there is a tension between the different factions in the pro-democracy movement. I think the vast majority of people are promoting peaceful rallies and marches, and but there are always, even on Sunday, there were people on the fringe who were involved in some violent activities. And so the danger is that something will spark a flare-up, and that the police will respond with force, with tear gas, and things will get out of hand.
Is there
But the organizers, yeah.
Is there a message coming from China to the protesters?
People are focused on Carrie Lam and the local government. They're aware of reports that the tanks are massed over the border. People say they are scared. They're worried about the possibility of a Chinese incursion. But when you talk to the more analytical people, they say it's probably unlikely unless things got really out of hand. As long as the police are able to keep a lid on things, we don't see buildings being burned. We don't see people being murdered in the streets. If that happened, there'd probably be a Chinese incursion. But as long as things are, a lid is kept on these protests, I don't think we'll see anything that drastic.
Well, what is there to believe that the lid will be kept on the protests, or what is there to believe that the lid won't be kept on the protests?
Well, I mean, we have to sort of go day by day and see how things develop. The police are being a little more conciliatory after Sunday's event, as is Carrie Lam. She's talking about the possibility of dialogue. And what has happened in the past with the 2014 umbrella movement is that even though it seemed to accomplish nothing, the government seems to, the Hong Kong government seems to back off. People are worried about the loss of the basic freedoms, freedom of expression, the rule of law, and if they back permanently off of this extradition bill and create some avenues for dialogue, that would point in a positive direction.
Well, there's the idea of dialogue, though. Part of the things the protesters want is they want Carrie Lam, who says that there should be dialogue. They want her to resign. And one of the other things that they're demanding, of course, is that the extradition bill, which is currently suspended and put on hold, that it be permanently eliminated. And it doesn't seem I don't see where, unless Carrie Lam is willing to budge on those, I don't see how the protesters are going to budge on their demands.
Yeah, and I think that the protests will continue. What the local government is hoping is that they'll sort of lose momentum, and we'll just have to see whether they do, because Carrie Lam is probably not going to resign, at least immediately. She's not going to permanently withdraw the bill. That may happen in the future, but it's a question of saving face. And I think they're just hoping that the protests will lose some of their momentum and then there can be some kind of discussions. But you know, it's tough. It's hard to see any kind of concrete resolution to all of this.
Well, with 1.5 or 1.7 million protesters taking to the street, does Carrie Lam, does she have supporters within Hong Kong? And if so, what are the groups that support her?
Well, absolutely. You know, there are 1.5 million mainlanders here, at least people who have come in the past 20-some years since the handover of Hong Kong to China. Recent immigrants, and they tend to support Carrie Lam. Big business supports Carrie Lam, and there was on Saturday there was a large rally of pro-Beijing people, you know, business tycoons, CEOs, corporate CEOs, and the trade union movement is also pro-Beijing. So, in a sense, the establishment is pro-Beijing.
But just not the protesters.
The populace is, you know, if there were, but not the protesters, and they're a big chunk of this population of 7.5 million.
Thank you, Michael O'Sullivan, our West Coast bureau chief. Thank you. President Donald Trump described the protest in Hong Kong as a tricky situation for Chinese President Xi. Trump also expressed hope the issue would be resolved quickly and peacefully.
I think it'll work out, and I hope it works out for liberty. I hope it works out for everybody, including China. I hope it works out peacefully. Hope nobody gets hurt. I hope nobody gets killed.
The president also issued a tweet suggesting that a personal meeting between China's president and protest leaders might yield results, saying, "I know President Xi of China very well. He's a great leader who very much has the respect of his people. He's a good man in a tough business. I have zero doubt that if President Xi wants to quickly and humanely solve the Hong Kong problem, he can do it," adding, "Personal meeting?" President Trump expressed his wish to end the trade war with China. Now, this trade war has led to a great deal of volatility in global markets, but Trump also noted that Beijing needs to first deal with the Hong Kong problem. I spoke with the president's national security advisor, John Bolton, on China's handling of the Hong Kong protests and how that might impact U.S. relations with China. Here is part of that interview with Mr. Bolton.
The Chinese have accused the United States of being the cause of all these demonstrations. They've said we're the black hand that's gotten all this started. And they've done things like publish private information about diplomats, U.S. diplomats in Hong Kong. That's the kind of thing that needs to stop. The Chinese have to look very carefully at the steps they take, because people in America remember Tiananmen Square. They remember the picture of the man standing in front of the line of tanks. They remember the statue of Lady Liberty. They remember voices of the Chinese people asking for freedom and democracy, and they remember the repression of the Chinese government in 1989. It would be a big mistake to create a new memory like that in Hong Kong.
What's the cost, though, to China? I mean, those horrible memories that you just recited, I remember them. I remember watching them, but China's done fine in spite of that. Why not take another round at it?
One reason that we're engaged in a very difficult economic contest with China now is one reason that they did well after that was by stealing American intellectual property, engaging in forced technology transfer, and not just from the United States, but from Europe and Japan as well. Something like 60% of the investment in mainland China goes through Hong Kong. Why? Because it has a judicial system that's trustworthy, based on the English model that we know in this country. The courts are thought to be impartial. If Hong Kong loses that reputation because of a bad decision by the Chinese government, they'll have significant economic consequences in China this time. And I can tell you, from what I've heard just in the past few weeks, the mood in Congress is very volatile at this point. And a misstep by the Chinese government, I think, would cause an explosion on Capitol Hill.
What do you think President Xi is thinking about what's going on in Hong Kong?
Well, I think if he's worried about the steps that he might take in the future, he's also worried about the spirit that everybody else in China can see about Hong Kong. They want their freedom. And I think what the United States expects, at a minimum, is that China will uphold the treaty agreement it made with the United Kingdom when Hong Kong was handed back to China, the commitment for one country but two systems, that for 50 years after the handover, Hong Kong would maintain its unique system and the freedoms that were left to it by the British. If that treaty is violated, that's a significant credibility problem for Beijing.
How Hong Kong, a former British colony, arrived at this moment in time to become the test case for China's one country, two systems policy is a long and colorful story. It dates back to the 18th century. Starting in 1842, when China and Britain signed the Treaty of Nanking, ceding control of Hong Kong Island to the British. In 1898, China leases Hong Kong and 200 other islands to Great Britain for 99 years. But by 1941, with the Second World War underway, Japan takes over Hong Kong, causing a mass exodus to mainland China. Britain regains control after the end of the war. And in 1984, the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and China's Premier Jia Ziyang sign a joint declaration laying out the conditions for the return of Hong Kong. Under the agreed-upon one country, two systems agreement, Hong Kong retains its capitalist economic system and its hybrid political system for 50 years starting in 1997. On July 1st, 1997, Hong Kong is officially returned to Chinese control as a special administrative region. To drill down on how China's handling of the crisis in Hong Kong might impact U.S.-China trade and future stability in the region, we are joined by Michael O'Hanlon. He's a senior fellow and director of research and foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Thank you for joining us. And before I get to the question of the impact, what's in this for China? Why does China care about Hong Kong?
Hi, Greta. Well, as you know, Hong Kong is one of the main economic engines in China. It has probably 10 or 12 big city engines of that type along the East Coast. But Hong Kong is the finance center. It's also, of course, as you just explained in that very precise and concise history, it's also a symbol of China's return to its previous status, a period during which it's now eliminated the yoke of domination by European and Japanese powers. And so the return of Hong Kong symbolizes, in a sense, the return of the Middle Kingdom, the way China used to think of itself as the great power of Asia, maybe even the greatest power on earth. So for symbolic reasons, as well as financial and general economic ones, Hong Kong is very important. It's also important, as you know, as a potential harbinger of what could happen with Taiwan. And this is where China feels a lot of constraints on its current possibilities for action, because if it were to do anything smacking of Tiananmen-like measures, it would, for very many decades to come, if not forever, make it unrealistic to think that Taiwan would ever voluntarily rejoin even some broader Chinese confederation. But that is a core goal, if not the top goal, of President Xi, to get Taiwan back. So it has that ramification, that implication for the future, as well as for current economic and symbolic reasons.
So what is the sort of direct impact of these protests on the United States and as the world generally, and is the world's interest different than the United States' interest?
You know, I think we all have an interest, first of all, in averting tragedy, just for obvious humanitarian reasons, but in keeping China at least loosely within the broader community of nations. If we have to essentially treat China as a pariah, not only in economic terms, where that's already happening to an extent, but in broader diplomatic and security terms, it's going to have huge implications for the stability of Asia, for the way the United Nations Security Council works, for the way big issues like climate change are addressed. China really is becoming the other superpower. And, you know, maybe still a step or two behind us in most ways. But I think the word superpower is appropriate to describe its importance in the world economy, in world security, in world diplomacy. And if China winds up essentially being a bad boy on the outs from proper cooperation because it uses brutality within Hong Kong and symbolizes and signals that it is not going to be evolving in a positive way in terms of its own human rights, its own governance, that's going to make for a different world, not just for a different Hong Kong. So I think we all have a huge stake.
Do you fear or foresee a Tiananmen Square type incident or not? What's your prediction? I realize it's almost impossible without a crystal ball, but what's your prediction? Where are we headed?
China desperately wants to avoid that. I think. And I was glad that John Bolton sort of reminded everybody, you know, of the vivid memories of Tiananmen in his interview with you. And I think that, in fact, China would be crazy to use lethal force against peaceful demonstrators. I'd be very surprised if it got to that. The only way anything could smack of Tiananmen in the end would be if there's an action-reaction process. Peaceful demonstrators, but then maybe one or two violent demonstrators within an otherwise peaceful crowd. Then the Chinese military, which has moved in perhaps to protect the airport, overreacts. And then you start to see a back and forth where no one can quite remember how it started anymore. And then sort of people go a little berserk. That kind of an uncontrollable, unpredictable dynamic is the main way in which I think lethal force and major violence could ensue. I don't think anybody wants to choose that as their first move, but it could still happen. And that's one of the reasons why, as President Trump rightly said, some kind of a resolution fairly soon is in everyone's interest.
President Trump says it's a tricky situation for President Xi. Do you anticipate, or is there a role for the United States other than sort of wait and see and watch? Are they in any way supporting the protesters for democracy? What's the role of the U.S.?
I think we should keep saying things like John Bolton said, that we should remind China of the stakes here, that, you know, at one level they're obvious, but at another level, if China ever thought it could get away with Tiananmen, because as you pointed out, they sort of did the first time. And we've got to remind them things have changed. In the 30 years since, we're in a less forgiving mood. We've seen more Chinese aggressiveness in the region. We've seen a greater Chinese power. We've seen 30 years of Chinese economic exploitation of a number of relationships. We're not going to be as forgiving. I actually think that message does need to get through. At the same time that, of course, we call for the demonstrations to remain peaceful and, to the extent possible, non-disruptive of the Hong Kong economy. It really is a remarkable number of people. You know, as you're well aware, we have these million-man, million-woman marches in Washington. We debate about whether the inauguration attendance was 900,000 or 1.2 or 1.5 million. Apparently, there are that many people out in this last demonstration in Hong Kong from a city of, you know, the size of New York. So it's an extraordinary outpouring of enthusiasm and of concern by the residents of Hong Kong. And I think, you know, China's got to take note of that.
As always, Michael, thank you very much. Michael O'Hanlon, Director of Research and Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Among the casualties of the Hong Kong protests is Cathay Pacific Airlines CEO Rupert Hogg. He resigned August 16th after China rebuked the Hong Kong airline for the participation of some of its employees in anti-government protests. More from Plugged In's Mil Arcega.
Caught in the middle of the anti-Beijing rallies, Hong Kong's official carrier, Cathay Pacific Airways, forced to cancel flights after protesters took over Hong Kong's international airport August 12th. The two-day shutdown left thousands of passengers stranded when Cathay Pacific found itself torn between the demands of the Chinese government to continue operations and the airline's unionized crews, some of whom walked out in support of the protesters. The walkout left cargo destined for overseas markets lying on the tarmac for hours. The airport shut down, and Cathay's handling of pilots and employees sympathetic to the protest movement drew the ire of Beijing regulators, leading to the resignation of Cathay Pacific CEO Rupert Hogg after only 27 months on the job. Cathay shares are expected to recover, but analysts say the bigger challenge for the airline moving forward is winning back the confidence of mainland Chinese authorities and airline customers. Mil Arcega, VOA News, Washington.
Cathay's now former CEO is being hailed a hero after reports that Hogg was ordered by China to name employees who took part in the protest. According to reports, Hogg did comply, but provided Beijing with only one name, his own. Airport protesters have since apologized for the airport disruption, which has been seen as a victory for Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. This is not how it is seen from mainland China. Beijing has launched its own campaign portraying the protesters as violent thugs intent on breaking the law. For more on the Beijing narrative and how China sees the protesters and their demands, we are joined by VOA's Cantonese service correspondent Raymond Yan. Welcome, Raymond.
Thank you.
All right, Raymond, we know how the protesters see this. What is mainland China's perspective on this?
They would like to spin it as evil as they could to the demonstrator. Even they try some of the media provocative term using the word cockroaches. against the demonstrator. This is the most horrible thing I've ever seen. And of course, they would like to manipulate that it's behind Taiwan and America for the, Taiwan and America are behind for this demonstration. And of course, there's no clear evidence to prove that. And at the same time, they were even doing the personal insult by using the Twitters, Facebook, or maybe some of the Facebook page which located in Hong Kong in order to demonize or spreading the fake news against a lot of people.
And I understand Facebook and Twitter has made some efforts to shut down those Facebook page and Twitter page.
Yes, that's true. But there's still a lot of Facebook page or Facebook group which based in Hong Kong. It looks like it doesn't relate with Beijing or Chinese government, but everybody know that they are pro-Beijing, pro-Chinese government, and their tone are horrible.
All right. I use the term mainland China, but I'm really talking about the Chinese government. Any idea whether the people of China, broadly speaking, are aware of what's going on in Hong Kong and what the government's saying?
There are a small group of people, I can say, that they understand what's the reason of the demonstrator in Hong Kong, that when they bypass that great firewall which set up by the Chinese government. Unfortunately, a lot of Chinese netizens who is living inside China, they don't have access of outside information, and they have no choice. They just listen whatever the Chinese government feed them. And so you will see that the past 2 or 3 weeks, there are a whole bunch of groups of people come from mainland China, went to Hong Kong, traveled to Hong Kong, and tried to launch their counter demonstration against the demonstrator. And you can see that this is quite powerful for the Chinese government for their information control and the misleading a lot of people inside China.
Do you see Carrie Lam withdrawing?
Well, there is
or resigning, I guess is the word.
Resigning. There's no clear sign, but at least we see a little bit back down, especially on Hong Kong time Tuesday. She announced that there will be a police inquiry for the entire situation. But of course, people, they are not by it because this police ombudsman committee, they only investigate related with the police brutality. And also, this ombudsman commission, they don't have rights to summon witness.
And Carrie Lam, of course, Beijing government likes Carrie Lam. Yeah. They support her.
Yeah, at this time, we don't see any back down yet, but you never know what happened. It might be at the last second. Who knows?
And the Chinese government, they're watching. The protesters are watching. Everybody's watching.
Oh yeah, everybody's watching, and they are waiting for the counterpart, waiting for the other side making mistakes, then they can break in.
How important is this to China? Is there a way to quantify that?
It's a matter of their power, their political life. They believe that they are scared that if Hong Kong changing, it might be like a domino effect, pushing the other city inside China. People may ask, if Hong Kong can do a reform, why we cannot? So this is what the regime afraid of.
And Taiwan is next.
Taiwan.
I mean, in their mind, I would assume they would. I mean, that's one of the things that mainland China is thinking about.
Taiwan is afraid that they are going to follow the footsteps of the current situation, like in Hong Kong. So that's why they are very gung-ho on anti-fake news come from China. And they are very resistant, very reluctant about the Chinese, the Beijing proposal, or the unifications proposal, because they never know what happened inside those agendas.
Raymond, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Raymond Yam, VOA's China Service. That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice of America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta. And do follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.